Welcome back to Communicology. Today I'd like to dig into something interesting, and that's a question of, do movies deserve First Amendment protection? Now, of course, the obvious answer is yes. I mean, that's a simple, easy softball question. But did you know they didn't always have that? There was a large chunk of time where they had no protection. Let's get into that. So let's do some groundwork for that kind of concept, because it's an interesting thing to think about, because you think about movies today, they're inexplicably tied to culture. Andrew Breitbart once noted how politics is downstream of culture, and you think of the idea of what's happening in movies as a primary cultural driver. You see a lot of people react and do things comparatively to what they've seen in movies, and then next thing you know, it affects culture, it affects then politics, and then you see it in this vicious circle. So what brought about that initial question about, do they deserve any kind of protection? Well, let's go back to early film. And, there was an early film called The Kiss. And this is a very, very early film piece from the late 1800s. And it brought about, it was just a short, but it basically was scandalous enough to people that it brought about regulation. Now, regulation wasn't governmentally imposed at the time. Typically, in most situations, anytime you hear of governmental regulation, it's because someone failed to self-regulate. So when you aren't behaving in such a way and someone tries to correct you and you refuse, it's not too long before someone brings in the government to try to make you behave a certain way. The movie industry is no different. So the question is, well, what are you guys going to do? And they decided to self-regulate. And they started bringing their own ideas about codes and things like that, and we'll talk about those in a little bit as it comes up. So this early movie, The Kiss, scandalized people enough that we just have to do something. So that's the idea of when we start talking about the idea of having codes. Now, what further helps bring this along is movie stars start to become public figures. It used to be that you could just be a regular old radio star and no one knows who you are because they only know your voice. So you could walk down the street and be left alone. And you can kind of be anonymous, because unless someone recognizes your voice, you could say that you're Howdy Doody or the Lone Ranger and no one knows who you really are, your real name, and you could have a radio name and nobody knows. But movies changed that, because now I can see you. Again, remember, we had silent films at first, then we moved to talkies, but still, I can see you, and I can say, oh, you're from that movie. And now we have the idea of a movie star being created. And think how much of a cultural phenomenon that has been, for, again, as long as the industry has existed, the idea of the movie star. Like, you're famous, you're in a motion picture. So as a result, we as the public react. We want to know everything possible about the movie star. So we see them and we want to know more. And that creates a weird dynamic because, well, how much privacy should they have? Do you deserve privacy? Because you put yourself out in public, ergo, you're a public figure. Should you get any kind of privacy? So that creates all kinds of weird issues. And then on top of that, you start seeing people start to push the notion of what should or shouldn't be allowed in movies. Are movies more harm than good? And, people who grew up in the 80s remember very commonly the idea of, the scary thought of like, oh, the movies are so influential, they impact people so much, we should protect our children from them. Well, that's not a new that's not a thing that's new to people like what I went through as a teenager in the 80s. It was going on in the early beginning of the industry, so much so that movies were, the idea of movies and their power was pushed to the Supreme Court clear back in 1915. And the Supreme Court at that time denied First Amendment protection. They labeled them novelty, entertainment, and novelty and entertainment will not have First Amendment protection. Again, this is 1915, so the country's not too terribly old at this point, and we're labeling things that they don't have First Amendment. Now, again, you think back to the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law, and it starts talking about freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom to peaceably assemble, freedom to petition the government. Well, that freedom of speech part comes into play. I mean, like, what does it mean, speech? Does that just mean standing on a soapbox in the town square? Or does it also translate into another medium, like radio or movies? Well, there's no speaking in movies. Aha. But is that still not yet expression of some sort? But there's no speaking, so therefore it's not protected. And it's just meant to be novelty. It's just meant to be entertainment, so why would it get any protection? But the First Amendment doesn't say only serious things get covered. So you can see in what I believe is a major fumble by the Supreme Court in 1915. So keep that date in mind, number 1915. So, of course, with no protection, you're going to be in trouble because if the government comes after you, they can control what you want. So what happens is Hollywood creates what's known as the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, the MPPDA. And this is led by a gentleman named Hayes, who creates what's known as the Hayes Office. And basically what they're trying to do is improve the image of movies. So the Hayes Office, what it does is it spends its time being PR for the motion picture industry. So all they're doing is working with civic leaders, the people who help the movers and shakers in the town, government officials, and church officials, because again, America is much more religious in 1915 than it is today. And, people have much, more heightened sensitivities to things being not sacrilegious and certainly not damaging to scripture, so you have all these things that come into play. And again, the Hayes Office is doing public relations work saying, we want to make sure we're working with you so we make films that everybody can get on board with, because obviously they want to make the money. They want to do their art, but they want to make money. So they do this PR work to make sure that everything's all smooth and good and okay and lovely. No ruffled feathers. So what happens is in 1934, we see the first true code, the Motion Picture Production Code. And this is an interesting thing. Again, 1934. So we're right now, obviously, we're past the Roaring '20s, and we're in the height of the Depression at this point. So the Motion Picture Production Code gets released. No profanity, no bedroom scenes unless they're married couples. No skimpy outfits. Kisses are regulated. No ridicule of public officials. No ridicule of religious leaders. And certain words are outlawed. I mean, what a list. Can you imagine, seeing that kind of thing flying in today's Hollywood? I mean, you hop on most streaming platforms and all of these are banned. They're just destroyed instantly. These don't get followed at all. But this was a major thing for film. We see a lot of these in primetime television still, in the family hour, of the day. But, we don't see these much at all in most movies today. But again, look at these. No profanity. I mean, well, you can see, again, if we're talking to civic and religious leaders, you can see why that one would be on the list. What public good is there to have your characters in your movies, swearing and being vulgar? No bedroom scenes. Well, we certainly don't want to promote, promiscuity. Scripture is very clear against that, so let's be very careful about how it's done. So if you're a married couple, fine. And you can see the outcropping of that later on when you start seeing in television the idea of when they show a bedroom, even if they're married, they have two separate beds. It's like, we can't show the same bed, but let's be really careful here. So let's make sure the beds are separated. No skimpy outfits. Again, we want to make sure that we're careful not to have, eyes wander places they shouldn't go. Kisses were regulated. They actually would time them. I can't recall what the exact time was, but they'd actually time how long a kiss happened, because a little peck on the cheek, fine. Peck on the lips, fine. You start getting into those long kisses and you're going to be in a lot of trouble with the code. So you have to make sure that you have that regulated. Now in modern movies they have what are called intimacy coordinators, people who make sure that everyone's looking at each other and touching each other appropriately whenever they're doing any kind of romantic scene. Back then they were timing kisses. So we like to make fun of them back then for what they're doing when they're not too far off of some of the things that they're doing today with intimacy coordinators. And then, of course, no ridicule of public officials, which, of course, right there, you can hear that's a clear violation of the First Amendment, because we should be able to have redress of our grievances against the government and have freedom of speech. But again, if they're not protected by the First Amendment, because it's just novelty, it's just entertainment, you can see the danger. Like if I go after my favorite public official, then they're going to come after me because there's no protection. So you can see why the code would have that in there, just self-preservation at this point. And of course, no public ridicule of religious leaders. So you see that as, obviously, we don't want to make fun of the church and of course the damage that could happen. So you can see where they're being very, very careful, because with no First Amendment protection, they could be shut down. And that's a big problem. Now, back then, fines were big, $25,000, which again, in a Depression era in 1934, $25,000 is a lot of money. So you certainly didn't want to, get that fine. So again, you have to weigh, like, do I want to do my art or do I want to make money? And most, production houses were on the money side. They want to make the money, so they don't care as much about doing the art. It's one of the biggest problems with Hollywood, from basically 2015 to 2025 and beyond, like their desire for art far exceeded their desire for money. So they made a lot of things that pushed their agenda-driven messaging that audiences just didn't support. But they still kept pushing it regardless. And so back then, of course, it was more self-preservation. Like we're going to get shut down if we do our messaging. So let's just go for the money. So that was a big thing. Now, where everything turns, and again, 1915, remember it was 1915 is when they were stripped of First Amendment protection. Follow a line the whole way to 1952 is when the Supreme Court revisits the case, or the notion of it having First Amendment protection, and then says, and now get this, they call them a significant medium for the communication of ideas. That was a quote, a significant medium for the communication of ideas. What a change. So you go from the idea that they're just a novelty, just entertainment, to be called a significant medium for the communication of ideas. What a change. But again, look at that gap. 1915, the whole way to 1952. That's a huge chunk of cinema history that was absolutely under scrutiny and had to be careful not to go too far or push too many boundaries, because they would be shut down or at the very least fined. Floodgates opened, because as soon as they're given First Amendment protection, they could do whatever they want. Again, you run the risk of the audience not coming, but they could still push whatever buttons, whatever boundaries they want. And that becomes a big change. So if you're looking through movies and you want to see, if you're looking through movie titles and movie themes, and you go from 1952 to 1953 and beyond, and you're going to see all of a sudden social problems, nudity, language, anti-government, anti-religion, just the floodgates just open. And you want to talk about cultural change. If you've ever wondered, like, why did the baby boomers act the way the baby boomers did? Look at the dates. So right when they're coming of age, right when they're getting into, into junior high and high school, here comes a flood of all these anti-everything and pushing all the limits movies. What a surprise that they would instantly enjoy, the kind of pushback that they had as a generation, because that's what they saw. So the way that, the flood created everything, the government, of course, wants to react, as they do. And then what happens is the industry yet again decides to self-regulate to be safe. So this is where you see in 1966 the Motion Picture Association of America begin, the MPAA. That's something that we know today. So when you go to see a movie and you see, is it G, is it PG, is it R, that's born in 1966. That's purely an internal self-regulation. That way, because you can imagine, yes, you have First Amendment protection, but I take my minor child to a movie and it's full of nudity and swearing, your First Amendment protection is not going to cover you for long. So you can see why Hollywood decided to create the MPAA and come up with their own division of codes and grading system. So you go to see a G movie, general audiences. So you're basically anybody from small toddler to grandma, everyone in between can go see this movie and no one really get ruffled too much. You go to PG and you get parental guidance. So again, parents, judgment call. You decide, should your kid see this or not? That's up to you. But we're telling you that we're going to start getting some adult themes here, so you need to be aware. Then at this point, you move into R, which is restricted. So if you're under 17, you're not coming in. So it's just not going to happen because it's definitely adult themes. There'll be swearing, there'll be nudity, whatever. Now, the interesting thing is this bucket in between G and R, the PG, fit a lot of things. So adult themes are in there, which meant some language issues, some sexual themes, and yes, even some nudity. And there's this huge realm in there, and then even like some violence too comes into play. And there's this big box in there that people aren't sure what to do with. And it's one of those things that it creates this interesting time. So if you go back and watch movies, especially ones from the 70s and early 80s, it's not uncommon to hear some foul language and to see a topless woman in a shot. And you're thinking, this is PG, what in the world? Because we're thinking of it from our current eyes. Well, our current eyes are shaped by a newer standard that came around in the early 80s. All of a sudden, there's this new window that comes up called PG-13, which says basically from 13 to 17, you need to be aware that we're going to start dealing with adult things. And then in the PG, we'll take and strip away a lot of the things. So PG movies, they could still have some swearing, no nudity. That gets bumped into PG-13. The other thing that gets bumped into the idea of PG-13 is violence. And that's how it all came to be. So if you're ever watching, say, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, it's the second movie in the Indiana Jones series, there is a scene where this one the cult leader has a guy who's going to be sacrificed, who's strapped down to a frame, and he reaches into his chest and pulls out his beating heart. And he's holding it while it's beating, and the guy gets lowered into a flaming pit, and the heart catches on fire, and he's holding this flaming, beating heart. People inside the industry saw that and were just aghast. They couldn't fathom this being a PG movie. That little kid, like an 8-year-old, will see someone reaching into some guy's chest with his hand and pulling out his heart, and then watching it catch on fire as the guy's lowered into a burning pit. And the industry said, we can't. Now, this is a rated R movie. This is rated R. This is like hyper violent for PG. So that's where we end up getting the PG-13, because Spielberg wanted the money that comes with PG, because if you move into an R, you instantly cut off everyone under 17. So no little kids are coming to your movie, not properly anyway, but they could sneak in obviously, but you're instantly cutting out a huge swath, which means families aren't going to come and bring their kids. Young kids aren't going to get dropped off by their parents to see it. You're cutting all that off, all that money. And young people are the ones that have the disposable income to watch movies. So instantly that becomes really challenging when you move into the R realm. So they created, just because of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, PG-13. And now it's become the catch bucket for most movies that you'll see. So most movies, that they want to have lots of swearing and things like that, in adult themes, violence, you can go in there. And in PG-13, you are allowed one F-bomb. That's it. So as soon as you have two, into R. You start having any kind of like long-standing nudity, into R. And so you can get away with little flashes of things here and there, and certain levels of violence, but then you start getting graphic with your violence, into R. So it created this catch bucket for nearly everything. So a lot of your superhero movies and stuff will get plugged into there because it allows them to be violent, but not too violent. And they can say some things and not seem too childish, but be more adult themed, but not too adult themed. So it's a great little catch bucket for all those movies. So parental guidance, PG-13. So if your kid's 13 to 17, be aware there's more stuff happening in here than you're not going to be happy with your 10-year-old in it, but you might be okay with your 13 to 15 or 17-year-old kid in that slot. So again, we owe that to Steven Spielberg and Indiana Jones Temple of Doom. And that's where we've been kind of in a cruising spot ever since. We still have the G, we still have the R, and we still have PG, and then movies get placed wherever they're to be placed. And that's all self-policing. That is not government control. So that's the industry saying, let's put it here. That way everyone stays off our back. And that way you can't complain as a customer because you've been told. So if you take your 4-year-old kid, and this happened with the first Deadpool movie when it came out, people who were familiar with the comic book knew it was hyper violent with lots of bad language. Well, they made it a rated R movie on purpose. So people who are fan of the Marvel franchise took their 10-year-olds to see it, and man, did they get treated to a lot of F words and a lot of violence, and a lot of parents stormed out and they were mad. Well, you took your child to a rated R movie. The industry did it right. They said, this is what it is. Now, you can argue whether or not it should have been an R movie. I mean, could you cut some of that out and make it a PG-13 like all the other Marvel movies? That's an argument you can have. But at the end of the day, is if you took your kid to an R movie and you heard R-rated things, you're the one at fault, because there's that you should know better as a parent, because that's why those codes were set up. So that's a fun little fact about all the scandals and the stuff in the industry that brought us to our current code structure that we have as far as our rating system, and trying to understand that and what brought us to this point, as well as that crazy time, when cinema did not enjoy First Amendment protection. It's weird to think about, but that was actually a huge part of a majority of the film industry. So that's what I have for you today. Thank you very much for tuning in. As always, please like, share, and subscribe. I appreciate that. If you didn't like what you heard, that's okay. Thanks for tuning in this long anyway. But I'll see you next time on Communicology.